For most of the world, Easter Island means one image: a giant stone head, a long face, heavy brows, a sloping nose, thin lips pressed tight. The head stares across a grassy slope, alone against the sky. It has been printed on postcards, travel brochures, and the covers of books that promise to explain the world's oldest riddles. The image is so familiar that it has become comfortable. We know this island. We know these heads. But the image is incomplete. It is not wrong in the way a lie is wrong. It is incomplete in the way a photograph cropped at the neck is incomplete. Because under the grass, under the slope, under the weight of centuries of sediment, the head is not a head. It is the visible tip of a much larger stone body, a torso, a back, hands with long fingers pressed against the sides, carved details that run from the shoulders down, swallowed by the earth. The giant does not stop where the postcard stops. It keeps going down into the dark, and the buried portion is not a rough stump. It is a finished form, cut with the same care as the face above the surface. The first time a person sees the full excavation, the reaction is almost always the same. It is not wonder at a new discovery. It is a quiet correction. The world saw heads because the island had buried the bodies. And once you know that, the comfortable image cannot hold. The Moai that stands in the Rano Raraku quarry does not look like a tourist photograph. It looks like a stone person who has been standing in the ground for so long that the earth rose up around the thighs. The hands are visible. The fingers are visible. The curve of the back is visible where the soil has been pulled away, and the weight of the figure changes completely. A head can feel like a portrait. A buried body feels like a memory under pressure. It feels like something that was meant to be seen whole, but the island itself slowly drew a blanket over it. The question starts small and then grows sharp. Why bury so much of the giant? Why carve a complete stone person, with every line of the hands and every detail of the back, and then let the earth swallow 2/3 of the work? If the people of Rapa Nui only wanted a face to watch over the land, they could have stopped at the shoulders. But they did not stop. They kept carving down, and the earth kept rising. Maybe the burial was not the plan. Maybe the soil moved. Maybe the statues sank under their own massive weight, the volcanic tuff pressing into softer ground over centuries. That is possible. But even if the earth did the burying, the question only shifts shape. If the ground rose around the giants, then the ground is telling a story too. It is telling a story about time, about how long these figures have been standing here, about how many seasons of rain and wind and root growth have passed, while the stone faces stayed in place, watching whatever they were built to watch. And that opens a larger crack in the familiar picture. If the earth had enough time to bury the bodies, then the island's history is not a short, simple story of a people who arrived, carved statues, exhausted their resources, and collapsed. The burial layer is a clock. It says the Moai have been here longer than the comfortable version allows. It says the visible surface of Easter Island is only the youngest chapter, and the older chapters are under the grass, under the soil, under the feet of the tourists who come to photograph the heads. The postcard has been lying by omission, not because anyone wanted to hide the truth, but because the truth was literally buried. And now that the bodies are visible, the whole island shifts. The Moai are not lonely heads on a barren hill. They are the upper parts of giants whose full scale we are only beginning to uncover. If this mystery pulls you in, like, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The next question is not only about the statues, it is about the ground that covered them. What does the depth of the burial say about the age of the island's memory? And if the earth hid the bodies, what else might it be hiding under the grass of Rapa Nui? Below the tourist's head, the body does not stop. The neck widens into shoulders. The arms bend and rest against the stone torso, long fingers set against the belly in a pose that has been held for centuries. The hands are not rough suggestions. They are carved with distinct fingers, with knuckles, with the quiet weight of stone that has become flesh. Everything the postcard cropped away is still here, still pressing upward from the earth. The chest swells slightly beneath the surface. The carved line of the spine runs down the back where nobody on the ordinary path was ever meant to look. Incise details travel from the shoulders toward the buried base, lines and shapes that remain hidden unless the island decides to give them back. When the excavation opens the ground around a Moai, it is not only a face that rises into the light, it is a whole stone person, marked with signs that the front-facing tourist never sees. On the back of several figures, fine carvings appear, crescent shapes, circles, arcs that look like painted belts or tattoos pressed into volcanic rock. The work is careful. It speaks of hands that spent extra days on surfaces that would vanish below the soil the moment the statue was set upright. That single fact changes the emotional weight of the object. A face carved for display is one thing. A body carved for burial is something else entirely, and this is not a single buried giant. At Rano Raraku, the excavation project that first gave the world clear images of the full figures found body after body beneath the slope. The famous heads that dotted the hillside were revealed as the visible crowns of a buried population. Dozens of statues, some standing, some leaning, some still tied by the shoulders to the living rock, all with the same hidden truth. The island had been keeping the greater part of them underground. The familiar photograph of a lonely head on a grassy hill now feels like a mistake. Not a lie, but a surface reading. The world saw heads because the island had buried the bodies, and the burial was not shallow. Some figures hold 3, 4, 5 meters of stone beneath the chin, vanishing into slopes that took centuries to cover them. The scale that the tourist misses is the scale of the hidden labour. Carving a face is a monument. Carving a full torso, a back, a set of legs that nobody will see again is a different kind of decision. It speaks of a culture for which the invisible part of the work still mattered. The Moai were not simply heads set on a platform for the living to admire. They were full engineered beings, shaped with attention from the top of the head down to the soles of the feet, even where the soil would swallow the detail the moment the figure was raised. The eye that mattered was not the tourist's eye. It was something else. Something that did not need to see the back to know it was there. So if the bodies were buried, and buried deep, the next question is not about the statues. It is about the ground that covered them. What does the burial tell us about time on this island? What does the earth around these figures remember that the postcard forgot? After seeing the full bodies, we now look at the ground that buried them. The Moai at Rano Raraku do not stand on a flat plain. They rise from the slopes of a volcanic crater, where ash and weathered stone have been moving downhill for centuries. The crater walls are made of soft tuff. Wind and rain break it down into a fine dust. That dust slides down the slope, collects around the statues, and slowly builds up. It does not happen in a single storm. It happens over hundreds of years, layer after layer. A moai carved on a slope might have stood with its full height visible for a generation. Then the ground began to rise around its base. First the ankles disappeared, then the knees, then the carved hands and the long back. The process was silent and patient, and it never stopped. At Rano Raraku, many moai are still embedded in the slope, their lower bodies hidden beneath several meters of compacted soil and ash. Some protrude only from the shoulders up, as if the mountain is holding them in place. The depth varies. One statue might be buried to its waist. Another, a few meters away, might be buried to its chin. The slope, the wind, the centuries of rain all contributed to a slow, uneven blanket. And this blanket was not made only of natural sediment. The quarry itself added to the burial. As carvers cut stone from the mountain, they left debris. That debris washed downhill with every heavy rain and settled around the finished and unfinished statues. In a strange way, the hands that carved the giants also helped bury them. The earth pressed against the stone bodies, covering the very details the carvers had worked into the rock. The long ears, the fingers, the patterned belts. The statues that had once looked out over the island with their whole form now looked out from a rising burial. This is why the world saw heads. The postcards, the early photographs, the tourist sketches, they all showed only the upper portion because the lower portion was hidden underground. The island had not just created giants, it had quietly swallowed them. And the ground that swallowed them is not a random pile of dirt. It is a second history, written in layers of volcanic ash, wind-blown soil, and the dust of the quarry itself. Each layer is a page. And the Moai are markers stuck deep inside that archive. The familiar image of a lonely head on a grassy hill is, in a strange way, a false image. It is not what the original builders saw. It is what time and earth chose to leave visible. The burial turned full stone figures into partial silhouettes, and that partial view shaped the whole modern understanding of the island. Only when modern excavations began to remove the soil did the buried torsos, hands and backs re-emerge, showing how much the earth had concealed. The story of a simple, isolated people carving faces became easy to accept because the faces were all anyone could see. The island's surface had become an archive, and the stone heads were only the visible edge of a much larger buried record. But the earth was not the only concealment. The island's very location raised a harder question. Why would a remote community dedicate so much of its life to stone? To understand why the builders began at all, we have to step back from the buried bodies and see the island they called home. Rapa Nui, a speck of volcanic rock in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The nearest inhabited land is more than 2,000 kilometers away. The nearest continental coast is South America, over 3,500 kilometers to the east. The island is 163 square kilometers of rolling hills, volcanic craters, and rocky shoreline. It is one of the most isolated places on Earth that humans have ever called home. That isolation is not just a number on a map, it is a daily pressure. Fresh water is scarce. There are no permanent rivers. The soil is thin and volcanic, easy to exhaust. The surrounding ocean is deep and dangerous. Food comes from gardens, chickens, and the unpredictable sea. When something breaks, there is no neighbor to borrow from. When a crop fails, there is no other island to turn to. Every person, every skill, every hour of work matters in the balance between survival and collapse. And yet, on this tiny, remote, resource-poor island, the people carved nearly 1,000 giant stone figures. Some stood more than 10 meters tall. The heaviest weighed over 80 tons. They moved them across the island, sometimes for kilometers, over rough ground. They raised them onto stone platforms. They placed heavy red crowns on top of selected figures. This was not the work of a generation. It was the work of many generations sustained over centuries. The labor cost is almost impossible to hold in the mind. Every day spent cutting volcanic tuff with stone tools was a day not spent fishing, not spent farming, not spent repairing a shelter. Every person hauling a statue across the island was a person not gathering water, not caring for children, not watching the horizon for danger. The work consumed food, wore out bodies, and demanded coordination. It took from the same limited pool of energy that kept the island alive. The common assumption is that the Moai were ritual luxuries, status symbols, ancestor worship, religious monuments. A society with enough surplus could afford to spend some of it on stone faces, but Rapa Nui did not have a surplus. It had a razor-thin margin. A starving island does not waste generations on stone unless the stone matters for survival. Unless the stone was not a luxury, but a necessity. That is where the mystery begins to turn. The question stops being how they carved and moved the giants. It becomes why the work was worth the cost. Why would an isolated community, living on the edge of survival, pour so much of itself into the creation and movement of multi-ton stone figures? What problem were the statues solving that made the hunger, the thirst, and the danger worth it? The Moai begin to feel less like decoration and more like infrastructure. Less like idle art and more like a working system that the island could not do without. The labour cost, when you really feel it, makes the statues seem tied to survival itself, not to mere ceremony. And if the statues were necessary, then the familiar story of Rapa Nui, the cautionary tale of ecological collapse, of a society that ruined itself by making too many statues, begins to feel too simple, too comfortable, a story that explains waste, but not necessity. In the next step, we will see how that familiar collapse story holds up against the weight of stone. For a long time, the story of Easter Island has been told as a simple, almost perfect tragedy. A small, isolated society, driven by competition between clans, carves larger and larger stone giants. To move them, they cut down the forests, rolling the statues on logs. The trees disappear. Without wood, they cannot build canoes to fish the deep ocean. The soil erodes. The crops fail. The ecosystem collapses, and in the desperate end, the people turn on each other. The Moai are toppled. The society that built them destroys itself. It is a powerful cautionary tale, a miniature model of a planet consuming its own life support. The lesson feels clean, almost satisfying in its grim logic. But the physical objects that remain on the island keep pressing against the clean edges of that story. The statues are not just numerous, they are enormous. A finished Moai on a platform could stand 30 feet tall and weigh over 80 tons. The largest ever carved, still lying unfinished in the quarry at Rano Raraku, is nearly 70 feet long and is estimated to weigh around 270 tons. These are not measurements from a society that is running out of resources. They are the measurements of a society that is moving resources on a scale that is hard to grasp. Think about the practical demands. Moving a single 80-ton figure even a few miles across uneven ground requires not just brute effort, but a sophisticated understanding of balance, leverage, and coordinated force. A slip, a miscalculation, and the giant falls, shattering into useless rubble and crushing anyone near it. This was dangerous, high-stakes work. It required teams of people who were highly organized, well-fed, and able to dedicate their time, not just for a season, but across generations. The collapse story asks us to believe that this activity was so central to their culture that they pursued it right up to the point of starvation, that they watched the last tree fall and still kept carving. There is evidence for ecological strain on the island. Palm trees did disappear, soil did shift. The island's environment changed under human pressure. That part of the record is real, but a changed environment is not the same thing as a simple, self-inflicted apocalypse. The story of the trees becomes a convenient, self-contained tragedy, a moral fable. The stones themselves are heavier than the fable allows. If the work was an irrational mania that destroyed its own foundation, we might expect to see a decline in quality over time, a desperate, rushed final chapter. Instead, we see the opposite. The carving became more refined. The statues grew larger. The red stone crowns, the pukao, were added, an extra, enormous burden, lifted onto the highest point after the main body was already standing. This is not the pattern of a dying culture. It is the pattern of a culture escalating its output, refining its technique, and solving harder engineering problems at the peak of its ability. The simple collapse story explains a fall, but it does not explain the rise. It does not explain the sustained multi-century drive to extract, carve, transport, and erect stone figures in the hundreds. It does not explain why, on one of the most difficult and isolated pieces of land on Earth, this was the chosen work of a whole people. If the familiar cautionary tale is not the whole picture, then the statues demand a different kind of question. Not what went wrong, but what was the purpose that made this enormous effort necessary? What were the Moai meant to do? To begin to answer that, we have to go to the source of the stone itself. We have to walk into the crater of Rano Raraku, the birthplace of the giants, where the work was not finished but simply stopped. It is there that the functional question becomes visible for the first time. The functional question becomes visible first at Rano Raraku. Not as a theory, but as a place. A volcanic crater on the eastern side of the island, shaped like a dark bowl of grass and stone. The slopes rise around you, and the first thing you notice is the silence. It is not the silence of an empty field. It is the silence of a workshop after the work stopped. The faces are everywhere. Some stand upright on the slope, staring out over the crater floor. Others lie half buried in the soil, their features still sharp beneath a thin layer of green. And then there are the ones still trapped in the rock itself, enormous shapes emerging from the cliff, shoulders and heads already free, the rest of the body still fused to the mountain. They look less like finished statues and more like a moment of birth that never completed. This is not a quarry in the ordinary sense. It is a nursery of giants carved from volcanic tuff, a soft stone that hardened when it met the air. The islanders cut into the crater walls following seams of rock, and they left behind more than ruins. They left behind a process. You can see the sequence. A rough shape blocked out from the wall, a deeper cut around the head and shoulders, the long line of the back beginning to separate from the stone. Figures at every stage of making, from raw rock to almost finished bodies, still attached to the mountain by a thin keel along the spine. The tools are gone, but the tool marks remain. Grooves and ridges in the grey stone as if the last hand pulled away only a moment ago. A ruin tells a story of slow decay. A temple crumbles over centuries. A city falls and the jungle covers it. Rano Raraku is different. The quarry did not decay. It simply stopped. There are almost 400 statues here, far more than anywhere else on the island. Some are finished, standing on the slopes like a silent assembly. Others are still lying in the positions where the carvers left them, face up or tilted, with the outline of the next cut already sketched into the stone. The largest unfinished moai lies in a trench at the quarry, still attached to the bedrock. It would have been over 20 meters tall, a giant that never rose from its cradle. The feeling is not of a cemetery. It is of a factory where the shift ended before the last piece came off the line. The mountain still holds its children. Rano Raraku gives the Moai their birthplace. Before the statues walked to the coast, before the red crowns were lifted onto their heads, before the platforms faced them inward toward the land, they were born here, cut from the body of the volcano. The quarry reveals a production system, a repeated way of working that turned raw stone into upright figures. It was not a single act of devotion. It was a chain of hands, a rhythm of cutting and shaping that must have lasted for generations. And yet the chain broke. All around you, the evidence is frozen in place. A half-carved face, a giant still imprisoned in the wall, a finished body that never made the journey to the coast. The silence of Rano Raraku is the silence of a question that will not go away. Why did so many statues remain unfinished, trapped in the rock where they began? Within Rano Raraku, not every Moai stands upright. Some have never left the mountain. They remain exactly where they were carved, still part of the same stone that formed the crater walls. The largest of them all lies on its back, still attached to the bedrock. It is more than 21 meters long, nearly twice the height of the statues that reached the coast. If it had ever been finished and raised, it would have weighed over 160 tons. Its body is almost fully carved. The head, the long ears, the hands resting on the belly, all clearly shaped. But the back is still fused to the rock. Around it, a narrow channel of chiseled stone shows where the carvers were cutting it free, inch by painful inch. The marks are sharp. They look like work that stopped yesterday. Nearby, other faces are only half released from the rock face. A nose, a brow ridge, the beginning of a jaw, but no body yet. Some are just rough outlines, ghostly shapes emerging from the tuff. Others have deep tool marks around them, rows of small pits where stone was hammered away. The pits are clean, unweathered. Centuries of wind and rain have not softened them. The hands that made those marks simply never came back. The quarry is full of these unfinished figures. Almost 400 statues are still here, in every possible stage of creation. Some stand upright on the slopes, half buried in rubble, looking out over the crater as if they are waiting. Others lie on their sides, still attached to the mountain, their bodies only partly freed. It is not a place of decay. It is a workshop frozen in mid-breath. You can almost hear the echo of hammers, the crunch of stone underfoot, and then the long silence that followed. The silence here is not peaceful. It is the silence of something that was never finished. A finished statue tells you what the builders achieved. An unfinished one tells you what they lost. It preserves the exact moment when the work stopped. The last hand that struck the stone never returned. The last rope that was meant to pull the giant free was never tied. That silence is louder than any fallen monument. So Rano Raraku is not a cemetery of completed giants. It is a scene of arrested motion, a place where the stone still holds the shapes that were meant to walk. And that stillness gives the whole island a different feeling. Something interrupted this process. Not a slow decline, but a sudden stop. The system that produced these giants went silent, leaving its work frozen in the volcanic tuff. But many Moai did leave the quarry. They travelled down from the crater along paths that still scar the landscape. Some stand on platforms facing the sea. Others lie fallen on the old roads, their faces pressed into the earth. To understand the full scale of the island's design, we need to follow them. The road from Rano Raraku to the coast is marked by fallen statues, like a trail of stone giants that ran out of strength. The path out of the crater was never a single road. From the slopes of Rano Raraku, the old tracks fan outward. Some run downhill toward the north coast, others cut west, then bend south. They are shallow depressions now, worn into the volcanic ground by centuries of rain and wind, but their direction is still readable. They do not wander, they aim, and along those tracks the island left a strange kind of clue. A few hundred meters from the quarry, a Moai lies face down in the grass. Its head points toward the sea, its body stretches back toward the mountain. It is not alone. Farther along the same route, another fallen figure rests on its side. A third sits at an angle, half buried in the slope. The farther you walk from the crater, the more of them you find. Giant bodies stranded between the workshop and the water. This is not a random scatter. These are not statues that were abandoned where they happened to drop. They are a chain, a broken chain, but still a chain. Stiller, The roads that carried them were never paved in the Roman sense. They were prepared routes, cleared of large stones, smoothed in places, sometimes marked by low walls or post holes for ropes. The island did not drag its giants blindly across open ground. It guided them along fixed corridors. The same routes appear again and again, linking the quarry to every ahu platform on the coast. Think of it as a single production line, stretched across an entire island. At one end, the crater where the figures were shaped. In the middle, the roads where they travelled. At the other end, the stone platforms where they would stand for centuries. The unfinished statues inside the mountain are one half of the picture. The fallen statues on the roads are the other half. Together they show a system that was not only about carving, but about controlled movement from a single source toward many destinations. That changes something important in the mind. A collection of isolated monuments can feel like separate projects. Each clan builds its own statue. Each village raises its own ancestor. That picture is not wrong, but it hides the deeper truth. The workshops, the roads, and the platforms do not feel like separate projects. They feel like one repeated process distributed across the land, the same hands, the same techniques, the same routes, used again and again. The island was not a gallery of independent artworks. It was a network, a layout, a planned geography where every Moai passed through the same birth canal and moved along the same kind of path to a final position on the edge of the sea. And when you follow those paths all the way to the water, you arrive at the ahu. Long stone platforms raised above the shoreline, precisely built to receive the giants. Each platform faces the island, not the ocean. Each one sits at the end of a route that leads back, ultimately, to the volcanic womb of Rano Raraku. So the question that began inside the quarry now reaches the coast. The system that started in the crater is still visible in the roads. It is still visible in the fallen bodies that line the way. It is still visible in the platforms that wait for the final figure to arrive. But one part of the system remains missing. The island's own memory says the statues did not simply travel along these roads. They walked. How does a stone giant walk? That is where the next trace begins. After tracing the roads and fallen statues from the quarry to the coast, we turn to the island's own memory of how the giants moved. The old tradition says something that sounds impossible at first. The Moai walked. Not dragged. Not rolled on logs, not hauled by the thousands, walked. The word the island used for that movement was mana. Mana is not easy to translate. It is not simply magic, and it is not simply muscle. Mana was force, authority, sacred power that could be held by a chief, a priest, a place, or a stone. When the old voices said the statues walked by mana, they were not telling a child's story. They were naming the invisible thing that made the stone obey. Picture what that memory might be carrying. A massive upright figure still hot from the quarry balanced on its base. Ropes around the head, teams on either side, a slow rhythm of pull and release. The statue rocks. One edge lifts, the other edge pivots forward. Step by rocking step, the body advances, not like a dead block, but like something alive in the hands of people who knew exactly how to control it. Even now, in our time, researchers have wrapped ropes around a Moai replica and shown that a small team can make it walk. With careful tilting and steady rhythm, the stone moves upright, just as the tradition remembered. That modern demonstration is a visible echo of the old phrase. It does not close the mystery. It makes the phrase feel more like a preserved engineering memory than a fairy tale. A dragged stone is cargo. A walking stone is a remembered technology. The people who carved these giants did not see themselves as movers of dead weight. They saw themselves as commanders of a force that could push an upright body across the island. And when they said mana, they gave that command a name that held danger, skill, and sacred power all at once. And here is where the tradition becomes harder to pin down. The same phrase, the statues walked by mana, can sound like myth, like an old ritual formula, like a workshop instruction passed from carver to rope team, and like a memory of invisible energy all at the same time. It refuses to sit quietly in one category. The island's own voice keeps the question alive. Was walking only a method of transport, or did the movement itself preserve something much older about the relationship between stone, force, and human will? That walking tradition gives the episode its central movement image. Not a dead monument pulled across the ground, but an upright giant walking forward, balanced and dangerous, carrying its own weight under the control of people who understood mana as something real. It is the image that will carry us forward now into the physical questions. What did it mean to move a figure this tall and this heavy? And what kind of control was needed to keep it alive on its feet? What does upright movement reveal about balance, ropes, teams, danger, and the human cost of guiding a giant that could crush anyone who lost the rhythm? Imagine standing on a slope of loose volcanic soil. In front of you, a stone figure rises as tall as a two-story building. Its weight presses into the earth, dozens of tons concentrated on a narrow base. It is not lying on its side. It is upright, and it must stay upright while moving. Now picture teams of people gripping ropes, not hauling a dead block across the ground, guiding a living weight that could tip, crush, or shatter at the wrong angle. The difference is everything. A dragged block is passive. An upright giant is a constant negotiation with gravity. The process begins with a small tilt. The statue rocks forward just a few degrees. Ropes on the sides pull to keep it from swaying too far. Ropes at the back control the speed of return. Every inch of movement requires dozens of hands working in exact rhythm. One person too slow, and the weight shifts unpredictably. One rope too tight, and the giant twists. The sound would have been a low, grinding rhythm. Stone against packed earth. Feet shuffling. Voices calling out timing. The statue does not glide. It marches in tiny, deliberate steps. Left, right, left. Each one a controlled fall and catch. The danger lives in the moment between steps. When the statue is tilted, the full mass hangs on the edge of balance. If a rope breaks, the giant does not simply stop. It topples. The people nearest the base have seconds to react. The ground shakes. The stone hits with a sound that travels across the island. To move a giant upright, people had to command balance, not just muscle. They had to read the stone, feel the rhythm, and trust each other's timing. This was not mindless labour. It was a dangerous, intelligent, coordinated act, closer to a dance with weight than to dragging cargo. A falling statue kills. But a walking statue, guided perfectly, moves with a strange dignity. It seems almost alive, and when you watch it rock forward, pause and step again, you begin to understand why the island's memory did not speak of hauling. It spoke of walking. That word, mana, begins to make a different kind of sense. It was not just a religious label. It was the name for the force that kept the giant upright, the command that turned stone into motion, the invisible power that separated a guided walk from a deadly collapse. The walking tradition now has a body. It has weight, balance, danger, and human cost. And that cost raises the next question with more pressure than before. What did mana really mean inside that movement? And what kind of force were the islanders remembering when they said the stones walked? The statues moved upright, guided by teams who understood balance and risk. But the island's own memory adds a word that changes the picture. The word is mana. Mana is often translated as power or spiritual energy. That makes it sound like mist. But the older meaning is closer to command. A chief had mana because his word could organize people. A canoe had mana when it cut through rough water without failing. A stone tool had mana when it worked better than another tool of the same shape. Mana was not a prayer. It was a directed force that produced a visible result. Think of a singer who can shatter a glass with a precise note. No muscle, no push, only a frequency matched perfectly to the object. The glass does not break because the singer wishes it. It breaks because the right vibration finds the right material. That kind of relationship between a focused will and a physical response is closer to what mana meant on Rapa Nui. Something was sent into the stone, and the stone answered. Oral traditions say the Moai walked because a chief or a priest commanded them with mana. The figure did not crawl across the ground like a dragged log. It stood and moved like a living body. The memory insists on this, and the word mana is the key that unlocks the strangeness. It suggests the movement was not only about ropes and sweat. It was about a force that could be directed through the statue, a force that turned dead weight into something that seemed to obey. Similar force words appear across the Pacific. In Hawaii, mana flows through chiefs and sacred places. In New Zealand, the Maori speak of mana as authority and prestige that can be gained, lost, or transferred. But on Rapa Nui, the word attached itself to the stone giants in a very particular way. The island did not only say that powerful people had mana, it said that the statues walked because mana moved them. The force was not separate from the object. It was inside the work. This is not a dismissal of engineering. The upright transport experiments show that ropes and rhythm can bring a statue down a slope without toppling it. But the tradition may preserve something older than the method. It may preserve a memory of the principle, the reason why upright movement felt different from ordinary hauling, the reason why balance and timing mattered more than raw numbers of workers. Perhaps the builders understood something about resonance. A stone shaped and balanced in a certain way can vibrate. A rhythm tapped out by many hands can travel through the ground and meet the stone at its own frequency. When the right signal hits the right body, even a giant can shift. This is not magic. It is physics that most modern people have forgotten how to feel. But a culture that spent generations cutting and moving volcanic tuff may have learned it in their bones, and the word mana may be the name they gave to that learning. So when the old stories say the statues walked, they may not be describing a poetic metaphor for hard work. They may be describing an active system, a stone body that moved because a force was directed through it. The giant was not a passive block, it was a receiver. This changes the feeling of the Moai. They stop being monuments to ancestors. They start to feel like devices that were meant to interact with an invisible field. The walking memory, the word mana, the shape of the figure, the volcanic stone itself, all of it begins to pull in one direction. The question is no longer how they moved. The question is what kind of force was being commanded and what the statues were supposed to do once they stood in place. If mana was the force that walked the statues, the builders did something even stranger. They added a heavy red crown on top of the already towering stone, a crown that came from a separate quarry, a crown made of different rock, lighter in colour but still weighing many tons, a crown that had to be lifted high and set onto a narrow head after the giant was already standing. Why add that burden? Why risk the whole statue to place a red weight at the highest point? The next object makes the simple worship explanation hard to keep. The word mana pointed toward a force that could move stone. Now the stone itself acquires a second layer, a red crown that seems to have been added for a reason beyond display. Look at a moai that still carries its pukao. The grey volcanic body rises from the earth, shoulders and back carved from the tuff of Rano Raraku. Then, on top of the head, sits a cylinder of deep reddish rock. It is not part of the same carving. It is a separate stone, brought from a different place, placed at the highest, most unstable point of the entire figure. A hat is light. A crown can be heavy. But a pukao is neither of those things. It is a cylinder of red scoria, a volcanic stone weighing up to 12 tons. That weight is perched on a narrow stone head, sometimes several meters above the ground. Adding it was not a finishing touch. It was a deliberate escalation of the engineering problem. The red stone came from a crater called Punapao. Punapao is not a random source. It is a distinct wound in the island, its rock a deep red brown, lighter than the grey tuff of the quarry where the bodies were cut. The builders did not simply pick up loose stones near the statues. They opened a separate quarry, cut the red scoria into cylinders, and moved those cylinders across kilometres of uneven ground. The pukao were a second operation, a separate journey, a second investment of time and risk, and not every moai received one. Out of the hundreds of statues spread across Rapa Nui, fewer than 100 are known to have held a pukao. The choice was selective. That means the red crown was not a universal requirement. It was given to some statues and withheld from others, which deepens the question. What made a particular moai worthy of 12 extra tons of red stone? Some researchers see the pukao as representing hair, perhaps a top knot, a sign of status. That may be part of its meaning. But meaning does not explain why a small island would risk lifting a 12-ton stone onto a narrow head. A painted or carved head could signal status without danger. The pukao required danger. It required precision. It forced the builders to solve a problem that did not exist until they chose to add the red stone. The moment a pukao is placed, the moai stops being a single carved monolith. It becomes an assembly, a grey body from one mountain, a red crown from another, joined at the most unstable point. 2 stones, 2 quarries, 2 journeys, 1 figure. That is not the logic of a symbol. That is the logic of a system, a structure composed of distinct parts, each chosen for a property the other does not have. If the grey body was enough to stand, why add the red weight? If the body was enough to face the island, why crown it with a different stone? The pukao does not answer these questions yet, but it makes them impossible to ignore. The Moai were not just heads, they were not just bodies, they were composite forms, and the red crown is the clearest sign that the builders were thinking in terms of materials, not just shapes. To understand why the red stone was necessary, we first have to feel what it meant to lift it. The next step is not theory. It is the terrifying physical act of raising 12 tons onto a head that already stands above the island. A Moai with its red crown standing against the sky looks finished, almost serene. The wide stone face, the long ears, the heavy brow, and above it all the red cylinder of the pukao resting like a final touch. But the calm image hides a moment of extreme danger. To understand why the crown belongs in the story of lost technology, we need to see the instant before it sat still. 12 tons of red scoria suspended above a narrow stone head, with only rope, wood, and human muscle holding it in the air. Think of standing on a ladder and trying to balance a heavy bucket on top of a narrow pole. The bucket wants to tip, your arms shake, the pole has no wide base. A breath of wind, a sliver of misalignment, and the whole weight will topple, taking you and the ladder with it. Now make the bucket weigh as much as 2 large elephants, raise the pole to the height of a 2-story building, and set the whole scene on a windy volcanic island with no engines, no cranes, and no room for error. That is roughly the problem the builders of Rapa Nui faced every time they lifted a pukao into place. The red stone came from Punapau, a separate crater several kilometres from the main quarry. Workers cut the cylinders from a different kind of rock, a reddish scoria that is softer and lighter than the grey tuff of the statues, but still heavy enough to kill. Getting the cylinder to the platform was the first test. Rolling a 12-ton cylinder over uneven ground takes hundreds of hands and a careful rhythm. One slip and the stone rolls backward, crushing anyone in its path. Then came the lift. Most likely, the builders piled earth and stone into a ramp that sloped up behind the already standing Moai. Teams hauled the pukao up the ramp with ropes, inch by inch, until it reached the level of the statue's head. Others waited on scaffolding, ready to guide the red cylinder over the flat top. The moment of transfer was the most dangerous. The pukao had to slide across a gap and settle exactly centred. If it tilted, the weight would drag it off the edge, smashing the scaffolding and pulling the ropes out of the workers' hands. If it struck the statue too hard, the Moai itself could crack or topple, burying the whole platform in rubble. Every living person on that ramp and scaffold knew that the stone was stronger than their bodies. The work demanded not just strength, but a shared silent concentration that held 12 tons in the air until the red crown settled into its final seat. Modern experiments have shown that ramps, ropes, and large teams could manage this. With enough people and careful engineering, the lift was physically possible. But possibility is not the same as explanation. Placing a 12-ton burden on top of an already enormous statue made the work harder, longer, and more lethal. A society that merely wanted to honour ancestors or display power could have stopped with the grey stone bodies. Adding the red crown multiplied the danger for no obvious practical gain, unless the red stone was not optional. Unless it completed a function that the grey body could not perform alone. The pukao begins to feel less like a headdress and more like a component, a separate piece of hardware that had to be joined at the highest point for a reason we can no longer read directly. The question shifts from how they did it to why the red stone was worth the risk. If the island's builders deliberately chose to lift heavy red cylinders onto narrow stone heads, then that choice must have changed the way the statue interacted with the world around it. The next step is to compare the 2 stones side by side, the grey volcanic tuff of the body and the red scoria of the crown. What did the pairing achieve that a single material could not? The pukao was lifted at great risk. Now we step back and look at the 2 stones together, the grey body of the Moai and the red crown placed on top of it, and ask what the pairing might have been designed to do. 2 different stones, 2 different quarries. The body came from Rano Raraku, cut from volcanic tuff. The crown came from Punapau, from a separate red wound in the island. The choice to use 2 materials and to carry heavy red cylinders all the way to the finished statue added enormous work. That alone makes the question sharpen. Why not carve the whole figure from 1 stone? Why not paint the head red instead of lifting 12 extra tons? A decorative answer is possible. A red crown could mark a figure as special, or signal status, or complete a ritual appearance. But decoration does not need weight. It does not need a separate quarry. It does not need the danger of balancing a heavy cylinder on a narrow head after the body's already standing. The extra effort points toward a purpose that went beyond how the statue looked. Think of a bell and its clapper, 2 pieces, different shapes, different materials. Neither does the work alone. Together, they produce a sound that neither could make separately. Or think of a tuning fork with a weighted end. The weight changes the vibration. It does not just sit there, it tunes the object. The Moai body was carved from a relatively light, porous stone. Volcanic tuff can hold a shape, but it also contains countless tiny air pockets. Sound moves through such material differently than through solid basalt. It can resonate, it can absorb vibration. The red scoria of the pukao is denser, heavier, and richer in iron. It feels different in the hand. Under a magnet it responds where grey tuff barely stirs. 2 stones, side by side with different physical signatures. Now place the denser, heavier, iron-rich stone at the highest point of the figure, the top of the head. The crown does not just sit there like a hat. It changes the centre of gravity. It alters how the whole statue would vibrate if struck, or if it were exposed to a deep ground tone. The hollow chamber of the body, the torso, the head, could act as a cavity, and the red crown could act as a cap, sealing the volume and tuning the resonance. This is not a claim of proven ancient technology. It is a hypothesis that begins with a physical fact. The Moai are made of 2 different stones, and those stones were brought together at high cost. That decision is real. The question is why it was made, and a functional reading, that the pairing was chosen to shape sound, vibration, or magnetic behaviour, fits the evidence at least as well as the decorative explanation. If the Moai were designed to interact with invisible forces, then the crown may have been the key component, a resonator cap, a magnetic focus, a weight that stabilized the statue's response to the deep hum of the island itself. The body becomes a chamber, the crown becomes a lid. Together they turn a carved stone into a device. This reading transforms the Moai. It stops being a portrait of an ancestor and starts looking like an assembled machine. Not a crude idol, not a simple monument. A 2-part tool whose function we have forgotten. The pieces of the machine are now clear. A resonant body, a heavy iron-rich crown, and a tradition that remembers the statues moving upright, powered by mana, by a force that was felt, not seen. The next step is to see where these devices were placed on the island. Not scattered at random, but arranged in a pattern, along the coast, on stone platforms, facing inward. The Moai were not meant to stand alone. They were part of a circuit. And that circuit is where the island itself begins to speak. The Moai, with their 2-part bodies, were not scattered randomly. They were placed on platforms that form a ring around the island, and they all face the same direction, inward. Walk to any coast of Rapa Nui, and you will find them standing on long stone altars called ahu, their backs turned to the endless Pacific, their carved eyes fixed on the land. The ocean behind them stretches for thousands of kilometers in every direction. The question that rises from this arrangement is simple and physical. Why would a statue guard against the sea by refusing to look at it? A security camera faces the area it monitors, not outward. The Moai likewise look inward, toward the inhabited land. If the function of the figures was to protect the island from outside threat, the posture makes little sense. A shield faces the danger. A warning bell rings toward the approaching storm. But these stone forms turn away from the horizon and stare into the villages, the freshwater springs, the gardens, and the slopes where people lived. There are more than 300 ahu platforms ringing Rapa Nui. Some hold a single Moai, others carry a line of them, sometimes 5, 7, or even 15 giants in a row. The platforms themselves are not simple piles of rock. They're carefully fitted stone structures, often with a filled interior of rubble and a smooth seaward wall, built to hold immense weight and to anchor the statues against the wind and the salt. The labour to construct an ahu was enormous, and the decision to place them in a nearly continuous ring around the island required generations of coordinated work. What makes the pattern harder to dismiss is the consistency of the direction. From the northern cliffs to the southern shore, the Moai face inland. A few exceptions exist, but the overwhelming rule is the same: back to the water, face to the land. This is not a scattered display of ancestor figures placed wherever a clan wanted them. This is a deliberate orientation that treats the island as a single watched space. The standard explanation holds that the Moai were ancestor images, set on platforms to watch over their descendants. In that reading, the inward gaze is natural. Ancestors look after the living. But ancestor veneration does not demand such rigid uniformity. On other Pacific islands, sacred stones face many directions. Here, the pattern is locked, and the platforms are often positioned near freshwater seeps, fertile ground, and the edges of village areas, as if the statues were not only watching people, but were tied to the resources that kept people alive. If the Moai were only symbols, the exact placement would not matter so much. But if they were part of a system that involved the land itself, its water, its soil, its stability, then the ring of faces begins to look less like a collection of monuments and more like a circuit. A circuit of stone figures all turned toward the centre, as if the island were the charged core and the statues were the instruments reading it. The burial of the bodies underground takes on a new layer here. A figure buried up to its shoulders, facing inland from the coast, becomes a fixed point in the landscape, anchored in the earth and aimed at the living interior. The platform, the statue, the red crown, the underground body, each piece now feels like a component in a larger design, not a separate cultural gesture. What began as a single buried giant at Rano Raraku has grown into an island-wide arrangement. The Moai are no longer isolated marvels. They form a deliberate ring of stone watchers, repeated around nearly the entire shoreline, all looking inward. The scale of the mystery has shifted from the statue to the geography, and the question is no longer why one figure faces the land, but what the ring was watching, protecting, or stabilizing. The next step leads away from the stone and toward what the land held: water, crops, and life. The platforms ring the island like a necklace of stone, each ahu a dark shelf of fitted rocks at the edge of the land, and on every platform the Moai stand with their backs to the sea and their faces turned inward, toward the living interior. Taken alone, one ahu can look like a clan shrine, but when you pull back and see the whole coastline, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. The statues are not scattered randomly, they are spaced around the perimeter, as if every major stretch of inhabited coast once had its own cluster of silent watchers. Think of it not as a collection of monuments, but as a circuit board. The naked volcanic island is the board itself, and each ahu is a node, a fixed point where something was meant to happen. The Moai are the visible components, the parts that rise above the surface, while the buried platforms and the earth beneath them remain hidden. A circuit board is useless without a flow, energy, signal, purpose. And if you start looking at where these nodes are placed, the island begins to tell you where the flow might have run. The platforms do not simply mark where people happen to live. They cluster near freshwater seeps, along the coastal edges where underground streams leak out of the volcanic rock. They sit close to the best agricultural land, the pockets of soil where taro and sweet potato could grow. They face the village sites, the places where stonehouse foundations and cooking fires have been found. The pattern is consistent. The Moai were placed where the island's resources were most concentrated, where life was already thickest. Now, a reasonable explanation is that this is just settlement logic. People build their important structures where they live. They put their sacred images where the community is dense, where the water is, where the gardens are. That part is not strange, but the uniformity of the pattern, the sheer number of platforms, the enormous effort of carving and moving hundreds of giants, this begins to push against a purely passive reading. A small clan does not invest decades of labour just to mark a boundary. The platforms are too regular, too deliberately placed along the entire coast, for them to be only territorial markers. They feel like something more integrated, something more functional, and that is where the image shifts. The Moai stop being monuments to ancestors and start looking like components in a system designed to manage the island itself. Perhaps a system for stabilizing resources, for channeling something the builders understood as vital force. The inward-facing orientation is not just a posture of protection, it is a direction of attention. The giants are not watching the people, they are watching the land, the water, the living centre of Rapa Nui. What emerges is the feeling of a single integrated machine. The stone bodies, the red crowns, the quarry roads, the coastal nodes, they all begin to click together. The island is no longer a collection of separate villages with separate statues. It is one system, with the Moai as its visible hardware. And the question of what that hardware was meant to do becomes sharper than ever. If the Moai were tied to the island's survival, they were tied to the thing survival depends on: water, soil, the balance of the land. The next trace will take us directly to that connection between the stone faces and the fresh water that kept the island alive. The platforms are not just near villages, they are near water. On a volcanic island, the most precious resource does not always sit on the surface. Rain soaks into the porous rock. It travels down through cracks and old lava tubes, and where that water meets the coast, it often seeps out at the shoreline as a lens of fresh water, trapped between the salt ocean and the denser rock beneath. For the people of Rapa Nui, these coastal seeps were not convenient. They were survival. When archaeologists mapped the island's Ahu platforms, a pattern emerged. Many of those ceremonial stone bases were not placed randomly along the shore. They were placed at the exact points where fresh water rises. Where a Moai stands with its back to the Pacific and its face toward the land, there is often water seeping up through the ground nearby. The stone giants are not merely facing the villages, they are facing the springs. A simple marker for a water source makes sense. People everywhere have marked wells and springs with stones or signs. But the Moai are not simple markers. A single statue could weigh more than 80 tons. The platform beneath it was a massive construction of fitted stone. The red crown on top was hauled from a different quarry. If you only needed to remember where to find fresh water, a pile of rocks would have done the job. The investment here was of a completely different order. That gap between a practical sign and a giant stone figure opens a different possibility. Perhaps the Moai were not only marking the water, perhaps they were believed to influence it. On a small island, water is life. Too little rain, and the crops fail. A contaminated lens, and people sicken. The fear of losing fresh water would have been constant. In that kind of world, a statue that stood watch over the spring might have been more than a landmark. It might have been a guardian. A figure whose presence was supposed to protect the water, or even to call it up from the ground. Oral traditions from Rapa Nui speak of mana, a force that could be directed by the living and the dead. The Moai were carved to hold the mana of ancestors. If that force could be placed into stone and turned to face the land, then it is not a large step to imagine that the same force could be turned toward the island's most critical resource. The statue becomes not just a watcher of people, but a stabilizer of the water that people need. This does not prove that the Moai were water regulators. The surviving evidence is thin, but the pattern is hard to dismiss. Stone giants, red crowns, enormous labour, and a repeated placement at the spots where the island's lifeblood emerges. The functional reading of the Moai deepens. They were not separate from the survival system of Rapa Nui. They were woven into it, and if the island had a system that connected stone, water, land, and community, then it must have had a way to remember how that system worked, to pass the knowledge forward. The island left behind more than stone. It left behind wood. Small wooden tablets covered in rows of carved signs, signs that no one alive can read. The rongorongo script, the locked voice of Rapa Nui, is waiting. In a museum, in a low-lit room, there is a small piece of wood. It is dark, worn, no larger than a man's hand, and its surface is crowded with tiny carved signs. Figures, birds, crescents, human shapes, strange heads. They are lined up in tight rows that reverse direction, like a snake coiling back on itself. No one alive can read them. It is like finding a locked diary in an abandoned house. The key is long lost. You can hold it. You can turn the pages. You can see the thoughts pressed into the lines. But the story stays silent. These are the rongorongo tablets of Easter Island. Only a few dozen have survived. They were carved from the wood of the Toromiro tree, a tree that once grew on the island but is now extinct in the wild. The signs were cut with shark teeth or sharp obsidian, each stroke deliberate. The writing runs in a pattern where the lines go left to right, then at the end of the row the tablet is turned upside down, and the next line continues in the opposite direction. The reader had to constantly rotate the wood, following the flow of glyphs like a path. In the 1860s, Peruvian slave raiders came to Rapa Nui. They took a large part of the population. When the raids ended, disease had spread and only a few hundred islanders remained. Among the dead were the last people who could read rongorongo. The knowledge did not just fade, it was torn away. Some scholars today suggest that rongorongo was not a full writing system but a memory aid, a set of prompts for chants and genealogies. But the sheer number of signs, over 600 distinct glyphs, and the careful structure of the texts point towards something more. This was not a simple string of reminders. It looks like language encoded in wood, and if it was language, then it could have held answers. The Moai, the platforms, the red crowns, the walking memory of mana, all these separate pieces of the island's puzzle could have been explained in those lines. The tablets might have been the instruction manual for a system whose hardware still stands. They might have told why the statues faced inward, what the red stone was meant to do, what word the builders used for the force that made giants move. Now the stone remains mute. The wood carries the signs, but the voice is gone. The hardware survived. The software, the knowledge that gave it meaning, did not. The tablets are fragile, burned by time and damp, and the last reader died over a century ago. The next step is to look closer at the wood itself, at the silence that fell when the voices stopped. The rongorongo tablets are not only unread, they are fragile in a way that the stone Moai are not. A single piece of wood can burn in minutes, rot in a damp cave, or be eaten away by insects over a few seasons. The entire written memory of a people can turn to dust while the stone giants still stand. Imagine a library where every book was carved into thin planks of Toromira wood. Then imagine a fire sweeping through that library, set not by accident but by conviction. That is not a metaphor. On Rapa Nui, after contact with the outside world, many tablets were deliberately destroyed. Missionaries saw them as pagan objects and consigned them to flames. Others were simply used as firewood by a population shattered by disease, slave raids, and collapse. Within a few generations, the island's written archive shrank from an unknown number of tablets to just a few dozen surviving pieces, scattered now in museums from Rome to Washington. Even those survivors are orphans. The last people who could read the signs died without passing on the key. Some were taken by Peruvian slave ships in the 1860s, vanishing into the mines and plantations of South America. Others perished in the epidemics that followed. By the time scholars began to collect the remaining tablets, the living link was broken. The wooden boards still carry thousands of tiny, exquisitely incised glyphs, but no voice remains to pronounce them. It is possible that the tablets never held technical instructions. They might have recorded genealogies, chants, or ritual calendars. But the mere fact that a written system existed on one of the loneliest islands on Earth is remarkable. Writing is not an obvious invention. It appears in human history only a handful of times, and almost always in the context of dense, complex societies. That Rapa Nui developed its own script, utterly unique in the Pacific, suggests a depth of intellectual culture that the simple collapse story cannot accommodate. Yet the real weight of the loss is not in what the signs might have said. It is in the silencing of a whole system of memory. The rongorongo tablets are not just a code waiting for a clever decoder. They are the surviving fragments of a voice that was systematically erased. When the last reader died, the island did not simply lose a set of texts. It lost the ability to speak its own past. The statues remained. The language that could explain them went silent. That silence makes the Moai even more poignant. They stand massive and enduring, while the wooden records that might have told their story crumbled into soil or ash. The hardware survived for centuries, exposed to wind and rain. The operating manual, if it ever existed, dissolved within a few human lifetimes. This is the cruel filter of preservation. Stone endures, wood vanishes, and with it, the instructions that might have made sense of the giants. And so, the question becomes sharper. If the rongorongo script was entirely local, a unique invention born in isolation, then the island's mystery deepens into something almost unfathomable. But what if the signs have echoes elsewhere? What if the same strange glyphs, or something like them, appear on distant tablets across the ocean? The next trace will look at that possibility, and what it might mean for the isolation of Rapa Nui. The rongorongo signs are locked, but they are not the only locked signs in the world. Place a carved glyph from one of the wooden tablets next to a symbol from the Indus Valley script, and the resemblance is difficult to ignore. The same sloping line, the same human figure with arms raised, the same strange creature that might be a bird or a man. Two scripts separated by half the planet, both unread, both carrying shapes that seem to share a distant family resemblance. This is not a claim of direct contact. It is more like finding the same unusual key in two locked doors on opposite sides of a vast ocean. The key does not prove that the doors open onto the same room, but it does raise a quiet question about the locksmith. The Indus Valley civilization flourished thousands of years before the first Polynesian canoes reached Rapa Nui. Its script remains one of the great undeciphered puzzles of archaeology. And yet, when researchers like Stephen Roger Fisher and others have placed the rongorongo glyphs beside Indus signs, the visual echoes are striking. Certain combinations of lines and curves, certain postures of human and animal forms, appear in both collections. The sample is small, the evidence is thin, and the academic world remains deeply skeptical. The similarity could be coincidence, the natural result of human minds drawing similar shapes independently. But coincidence is a word that loses strength when it has to explain too many things at once. The same island that carved nearly 1,000 stone giants, that remembered them walking by Mana, that placed them in a ring facing inward, also left a script that seems to echo a script from a lost civilization on the other side of the world. The Moai themselves already refuse the simple isolation story. They are not simple ancestor statues. They are engineered figures with buried bodies, red stone crowns, and a remembered ability to walk upright. The script adds another crack in that wall. One anomaly can be dismissed. Several anomalies stacked together begin to feel like a pattern. The rongorongo tablets, instead of confirming the island's isolation, start to pull Rapa Nui into a larger story. They hint at a deeper layer of shared memory, a common thread of signs that may have once connected distant parts of the human world. The island begins to feel less like a lonely outpost and more like a surviving fragment of a larger vanished map. If writing could share a hidden ancestry, perhaps the knowledge of working with stone and force did too. The Moai, the crowns, the walking memory, the inward-facing platforms, all of these may be local expressions of a much older and wider design. Now the pieces are converging. Buried stone bodies, red crowns, walking giants, a ring of watchers, and a locked script that points beyond the horizon. The question is no longer whether the Moai were part of a system. The question is whether that system was only island scale, or whether it was planetary. The next step is to gather all these traces and ask if the Moai were the surviving hardware of a lost global network. The rongorongo signs opened a crack in the island's isolation, and that crack makes us look back at the Moai themselves with a different question. If the Moai were only statues, why do the body, the crown, the platform, and the remembered force of Mana all point in the same direction? Imagine walking into a workshop and finding a heavy stone gear, a wooden shaft, and a wheel. Separately, each piece could be decoration or symbol, but found together, in one place, the mind begins to picture a machine. The island gives us something similar. It leaves us a huge carved body of grey volcanic tuff, a material that carries vibration. It leaves a red scoria cylinder, a different stone, quarried from a different wound in the island, placed with enormous danger on top of the head. It leaves a ring of coastal platforms where the giants stand with their backs to the sea, and their faces turned inward as if watching the living interior. And it leaves a memory, passed from voice to voice, that the statues walked, moved not by ropes alone, but by Mana, by command, by a force that the old language treated as real. None of these details is hidden. They sit in the open, the body that can hum with sound, the crown that changes the weight and the material at the highest point, the platform that repeats around the island like a circuit. The word that insists movement came from something beyond muscle. Each trace is visible, but together they start to feel less like separate clues and more like parts of a single design. This is not a claim of proven lost technology. It is a question the island itself forces us to hold. When a site gives you stone bodies that can resonate, red crowns that add weight where weight is hardest to balance, platforms that face inward like receivers, and an oral memory that treats movement as commanded force, the simple label of monument begins to feel too small. The pieces press against each other. They begin to suggest a function that is no longer visible. At some point, the separate artifacts shift. They stop looking like isolated ritual objects and start looking like surviving hardware. Like a receiver without its signal, a stabilizer without the field it was built to touch. The Moai become not just stone ancestors, but stone components. The manual is gone. The language that might have explained it sits locked on wooden tablets. But the hardware remains. The question is no longer whether the Moai were more than faces. The question is what kind of force they were shaped to meet. If the island built a system of resonant bodies, heavy crowns, and inward-facing platforms, then the next step is not to close the mystery, but to ask what that system might have been listening to. What force runs through volcanic stone, through the ground, through the air, that a circle of stone giants could have been built to touch? Place your hand on a drum when it is struck. You do not just hear the sound, you feel it in your bones. The skin vibrates and your body reads that vibration as a physical presence, not as a thought. Something similar happens with stone. Not in the same way, but close enough to make a person stop and wonder. The Moai are not drums, but they are made of volcanic tuff, a stone born from fire and ash. Tuff is dense enough to hold a shape for centuries, but porous enough to let sound and vibration pass through it. Not like air, not like water, but enough. Enough to carry a tremor from the ground into the body of the statue. Enough to make a giant hum quietly when the earth shifts. And Rapa Nui does shift. It is a volcanic island. The ground trembles, the seafloor groans. The crater of Rano Raraku itself is a wound in an old volcano. The island does not sleep in stillness. It breathes in small seismic pulses and deep volcanic rhythms. Some Moai have hollow spaces inside them, chamber-like cavities in the chest or back. Not accidental gaps, carved spaces, spaces that change the way sound moves through the stone. A solid block absorbs vibration. A hollow body can resonate. It can hold a frequency longer. It can amplify a tremor that a solid wall would only muffle. Now think back to the old memory of Mana. The islanders did not say the statues were dragged. They said they walked. They moved by force, by authority, by a power that could command stone. What if that memory was not only poetry? What if Mana named something that the builders could feel but not write down? The rhythm of the earth, the pulse of the volcano, the vibration that could be guided into the stone and used to shift its balance. A drum does not walk, but a drum can make a body feel a rhythm so strongly that the body wants to move. A stone giant, hollow in the right places, standing on trembling ground, might have been built to receive that rhythm, not to dance, to stand, to hold, to stay upright while the island shook. This is not a claim that the Moai were musical instruments, or that the Rapa Nui people used sound to lift tons of rock. The surviving evidence is thin, but the physical possibility is real. Volcanic tuff carries vibration. Hollow chambers change resonance. Seismic islands tremble. And a tradition remembers that the statues moved by an invisible force. Put those pieces together, and vibration stops being an abstract word. It becomes something the stone could have felt, something the builders could have used, even if the exact knowledge died with them. The Moai may have been built to feel the earth's rhythm, not to make music, to listen, to stand in the tremors and not fall, to turn the island's hidden pulse into a steady, silent presence. A stone body that listens to the ground is not just a statue, it is a receiver tuned to the world beneath it. And if that is even partly true, then the next question becomes harder to ignore. Could the Moai have listened to the island itself? Vibration is not the only unseen force that travels through stone. Some rocks can hold a magnetic memory, a faint record of the direction the earth itself was pulling when the stone first cooled from fire. To understand why that matters on Rapa Nui, it helps to begin far from the island with something as simple as flowing lava. When molten rock pours out of the ground and begins to harden, tiny grains of iron-rich minerals inside it act like miniature compass needles. While the lava is still hot and liquid, those grains can rotate freely. But as the temperature drops past a critical point, the iron minerals freeze in place, locked into alignment with whatever magnetic field surrounds them at that moment. The result is a piece of stone that has, in a sense, remembered the direction of the Earth's poles from the exact time of its birth. This is not a metaphor. It is a measurable physical property called thermoremanent magnetization, and it means that a volcanic landscape is not just a pile of old rock. It is a frozen archive of planetary force. Rapa Nui is a volcanic island from its deepest floor to its highest crater. Its dark basaltic slopes, the grey tuff of Rano Raraku, even the red scoria of Pukao, all carry iron in their mineral structure. The Moai were carved from that iron-rich stone. When a statue was cut from the quarry wall, the rock it was made of had already been holding a magnetic signature for hundreds of thousands of years. The body of every giant carried within it a silent alignment to a much older Earth. Modern instruments can read that alignment. Researchers have measured magnetic anomalies across the island, variations in the local field that do not match a simple uniform background. Some of these anomalies trace the outlines of lava flows and volcanic vents. Others cluster near the Ahu platforms, near the places where the Moai were set to stand. The pattern is subtle, and not every statue sits on a strong magnetic feature. But enough of them do to make the question unavoidable. Was the placement of the Moai guided only by clan territory and fresh water? Or was there another layer to the map, one written in invisible lines of force? This is not a claim that the Rapa Nui people built magnets, or that they understood geomagnetism in the language of modern science. That would be a leap the evidence cannot support. But the island itself is a magnetic environment, and the builders lived inside it for centuries. They walked its slopes, they dug its stone. They would have noticed in their own way that certain places felt different, that some rocks behaved strangely, that lightning or ground tremor seemed to favour certain paths. Across many ancient cultures, people associated powerful stone with a kind of living presence. On Rapa Nui, that presence may have had a physical root buried in the iron of the volcanic earth. Magnetism changes the scale of the investigation. Sound and vibration move through the ground and the air. A magnetic field is something larger. It is a planetary skin, invisible, generated by the churning core of the Earth itself. If the Moai were placed with awareness of that field, they stop being simple watchers of the village. They become points of contact between the human world and the deep currents of the planet. A carved face is one thing. A magnetized landscape full of repeated giants begins to feel like something else. The pieces we have gathered so far begin to converge. Buried stone bodies holding iron, red crowns of different mineral character, platforms ringing the coast with faces turned inward, mana, remembered as a force that moved stone without rope, and now the ground beneath it all, carrying a silent magnetic pattern that has been there since the island first rose from the sea. None of these details alone is proof, but taken together, they make it harder to see the Moai as only monuments. They start to look like hardware placed on a landscape that was itself active. If the island held a magnetic field, where did that field connect? Was Rapa Nui a closed circuit, a self-contained system tuned to its own volcanic heart? Or was it one node in a much wider chain, a single stone note in a planetary arrangement that we have almost entirely forgotten? Imagine finding a lock without a key, a wheel without an axle, a gear without a chain. The island has given us something similar, a set of pieces that seem designed to work together, but whose operating purpose disappeared long before anyone could write it down. Each piece on its own is already difficult to explain. The massive buried body of the Moai, hidden beneath the grass, made the tourist postcard feel like a cropped photograph of a much larger machine. The red scoria crown, quarried from a separate wound in the island at Punapau, added 12 tons of different stone to the highest and most unstable point of the figure. The Rano Raraku workshop still holds figures half-born from the volcanic slope, as if a production line stopped in the middle of a shift. The oral memory insists that the statues walked, not dragged, and attached the word mana to that movement, a word that means force, authority, command, and sacred power all at once. The Ahu platforms form a ring around the coast with the Moai facing inward, backs to the endless ocean, watching the living land. And the rongorongo tablets, carved with signs no living person can read, sit in museums like a locked instruction manual. Alone, each of these details can be folded into the familiar story. A burial, a ritual crown, an unfinished quarry, a myth, a clan arrangement, a lost script. But when you place them side by side, the familiar story begins to feel like an explanation for parts that were never meant to stand alone. The buried body, the red crown, the frozen workshop, the walking memory, the inward ring, the silent script. Each becomes a component of something larger. A body built to do more than be seen. A crown that changed the figure's physical properties rather than merely decorating it. A production site that stopped, not a cemetery that filled. A movement memory that sounds less like legend and more like the name of a lost method. A ring of watchers arranged in a pattern that makes the whole island feel like a circuit. And a language that may have once described how the pieces fit together. This is not a proven fact. It is a reading that the island's own objects keep inviting. The stones themselves do not announce a system, but they refuse to be fully explained by the simple story that usually contains them. The harder you look at the separate traces, the more they seem to belong to one question. When you gather the body, the crown, the quarry, the walking, the ring and the script, the Moai stop feeling like isolated monuments. They begin to feel like surviving components of a technology whose operating knowledge vanished. The mystery shifts from what are they to how did they work, and if they worked as part of a larger design, the next question becomes harder to ignore. Was this hardware built only for Rapa Nui, or was it one node in a much larger planetary design? On a map, Rapa Nui looks like a mistake. 2,000 miles of open water lie between this tiny volcanic triangle and the coast of South America. To the west, the nearest inhabited land is Pitcairn Island, itself a remote speck. This is not simply distance. It is the kind of emptiness that makes a place feel like an accident of geology rather than a destination. But the emptiness is not as complete as a simple map suggests. Beneath the surface of the Pacific, the ocean floor rises and falls in ridges, plateaus, and submerged mountain chains. The island we see is only the highest tip of a much larger volcanic mass that drops away into deep water. And during the last ice age, when sea levels were over 120 meters lower than today, that underwater landscape would have looked very different. Entire shelves that are now drowned would have been dry land. The map of the Pacific was not always so empty. It held more islands, more exposed ridges, more places where human memory could have taken root. Oral traditions across the Pacific speak of lands that sank. Stories from the central and eastern Pacific remember islands that disappeared beneath the waves, sometimes violently, sometimes slowly. The sea is not just a barrier in these traditions, it is a force that swallowed home ground. None of this is proof of a lost continent. The geology does not support an Atlantis in the Pacific. But it does support something quieter and harder to dismiss. The sea floor may hold older human landscapes that were submerged as the ice melted and the water rose. The visible islands are not the whole story, they are the parts that stayed above the surface, and if that is true, then Rapa Nui begins to look less like an isolated edge and more like a surviving summit. The loneliest island on the map may not have been lonely in a deeper past. It may have been one node in a larger geography, one high point that remained after the ocean climbed and swallowed everything else around it. This changes the meaning of the Moai. If Rapa Nui was once part of a wider world, then the statues are not just the creation of a single-stranded culture. They become the surviving sentinels of a landscape that no longer exists. The inward-facing giants, the red crowns, the locked script, the stone that may have been shaped to receive a frequency, all of it begins to feel like a remnant of something larger than the island alone. The ocean around Rapa Nui is not empty. It is an archive. The water hides the floor where older stories stood. So how does the ocean hide older worlds? The ocean that isolates Rapa Nui is not only a barrier, it is also a keeper. Water does not simply dissolve and erase. In the cold, dark, low-oxygen depths it can bury and protect. Sediment settles slowly, sealing whatever lies beneath. Wood, stone, even traces of organic life can survive for thousands of years in that silent archive. The immense Pacific that surrounds Easter Island is no exception. Off the coast of northern Europe, the drowned land of Doggerland has yielded tools and bones from a world that vanished beneath the waves. In the Black Sea, ancient shipwrecks have been preserved perfectly in anoxic waters, their wooden hulls still intact after millennia. These are not myths. They are physical evidence that the seafloor can act as a sealed museum, holding the remains of landscapes that once stood in the open air. The conditions around Easter Island are different, but the principle remains. What the ocean covers, it can also keep. Rapa Nui is not a lone rock jutting from the abyss. It is the tip of a much larger volcanic ridge, the Sala y Gomez Ridge, stretching hundreds of kilometers eastward beneath the surface. The island's submerged flanks descend steeply, but there are also broad shelves and terraces that were above water during the last ice age. At that time, sea levels were over 100 meters lower. The island's footprint would have been larger, and other peaks in the ridge may have stood as islands themselves, forming a small archipelago where today there is only one visible point. Underwater volcanic formations, crater-like structures, and ancient shorelines now lie hidden beneath the blue. Yet the ocean floor around Rapa Nui remains one of the least examined places on Earth. The water is deep, the current strong, and visibility often poor. Deep-sea exploration is expensive and logistically difficult. Only a tiny fraction of the submerged terrain has been mapped in any detail. The rest is a blank on the chart, a silence that technology has not yet broken. We are not claiming that a sunken city lies hidden beneath the waves, but the archive is unread. The possibility remains open. The sea floor around the island has not been searched systematically for human-made structures. It has not revealed its secrets because no one has looked hard enough. The emptiness around Rapa Nui begins to feel less like a void and more like a library of lost worlds. The Moai may be the sentinels of a landscape that shrank, of a memory that the sea swallowed. Their stone faces stare inland, but the ocean behind them might hold the missing chapters of the story they once guarded. The ocean transforms from an obstacle into an archive. The isolation of Rapa Nui deepens the mystery, because it hints at what might have been lost, not just what remains. The visible island becomes only the index page of a much thicker book, most of whose pages are now underwater. If the Pacific hides missing land, then how many other surface monuments around the world are only the fragments of a larger whole? From the ocean's hidden archive, we now turn to other surface monuments that share the same mysterious language of stone and alignment. Rapa Nui was not the only place where builders fixed enormous stone to the sky. Across the globe, other cultures left behind works that seem to speak a similar quiet grammar. On the Giza Plateau in Egypt, the three great pyramids sit in near-perfect alignment with the cardinal points. Their sides face north, south, east and west, with an accuracy that still makes surveyors pause, and their arrangement on the ground mirrors the belt stars of Orion, as they would have appeared thousands of years ago. A celestial map pressed into stone. Half a world away, in the Valley of Mexico, the ancient city of Teotihuacan stretches along the Avenue of the Dead. The Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, and the temple complexes are not random. They align with the rising of the Pleiades, with the sun on the summer solstice, with a deliberate geometry that turns the whole city into a stone calendar. And on Easter Island, the Moai stand with their backs to the ocean, their faces turned inland toward the living island. Some researchers have noted that certain Ahu platforms align with the winter solstice sunrise or with the equinox, as if the statues were not simply watching the village but also marking a point where earth and sky meet. These cultures never touched one another. Egypt, Mesoamerica, and remote Rapa Nui were separated by thousands of miles and by millennia. There is no evidence of a direct chain of instruction, no map that traces a single teacher from the Nile to the Pacific. Yet the impulse to fix stone to the sky appears again and again, as if a shared instinct or memory travelled beneath the surface of human movement. When the same pattern repeats in isolation, it stops looking like coincidence. It begins to look like a surviving fragment of a much older way of reading the Earth. The Moai are no longer a lonely anomaly. They join a quiet planetary pattern of stone systems that seem to know something about direction, about cosmic rhythm, about aligning the weight of the world with the order of the sky. One stone system can be dismissed. Distant stone systems asking the same question become harder to ignore. If you draw lines between the great stone sites of the ancient world, strange patterns begin to surface. A line from the pyramids of Giza across the width of Africa, out over the Atlantic and into the Andes, passes remarkably close to Machu Picchu. Another great circle connects Angkor Wat in Cambodia with the Nazca lines of Peru, and if you extend that geometry further into the vast Pacific, the next solid land that the line touches is Easter Island. These alignments are not proof of a lost global design, but they are not random noise either. Too many of the oldest and heaviest monuments on Earth appear to occupy the same narrow bands of latitude, or to sit at points where the planet's natural geometry, its bulge, its magnetic field, its seismic zones, seems to concentrate. Some have called these alignments ley lines, invisible threads of Earth energy that ancient builders could sense and mark with stone. The term itself comes with a lot of baggage, and the science behind it is thin. But the underlying question is harder to dismiss. Why do so many cultures, separated by oceans and thousands of years, place their most sacred and most technically demanding structures at locations that later turn out to be geologically unusual? Rapa Nui fits into this pattern in a way that feels almost deliberate. The island is a volcanic peak on the eastern edge of the Pacific Plate, sitting above a mantle hotspot that has been active for millions of years. Its rocks are rich in iron, basalt and other minerals that interact with the Earth's magnetic field. Modern surveys have detected magnetic anomalies across the island, places where a compass needle does not behave as expected. And the Moai, made from that same volcanic material, are placed not randomly across the landscape but in a clear ring around the coast, all facing inward toward the magnetic centre. If the Earth itself is a kind of circuit board, then Rapa Nui begins to look less like a remote speck and more like a node. A point where the planet's energy, whether magnetic, seismic, or something we have lost the language to name, was intentionally marked and managed. The Moai, with their iron-rich bodies and their inward-facing posture, might have been more than watchers of the living island. They might have been terminals in a much larger network, stone hardware tuned to a planetary frequency. None of this can be proved with the evidence we have. The lines on a map are suggestive, not conclusive. The magnetic measurements are real, but their connection to ancient intent is still speculation. Yet the pattern keeps appearing. Easter Island, Giza, Machu Picchu, Angkor Wat, sites that demanded impossible labour at locations that later turn out to be geophysically active or magnetically unusual. The same question echoes across continents. What were they building, and for whom, or for what? The Moai, seen this way, become world-scale hardware. They are not merely the remaining sentinels of a lost island system. They are one surviving set of components in a planetary chain of stone, a chain that once may have stretched from the Pacific to the Nile, from the Andes to the jungles of Southeast Asia. A network of Earth-anchored monuments, each one placed at a key point in a global field. And if that field was real, then the Moai were not just art. They were not just ancestors. They were part of the machinery of the planet itself. But machinery breaks. Networks go silent. What remains when the chain is severed and only the stones stay? We have walked a long road across a small island. We began with a single image, a stone head above the grass, a face that the world knew from postcards and documentaries. And the first thing the island taught us was that the head was not alone. Beneath the soil the body waited, hands, a torso, a back marked by carving. The object was larger than the picture, deeper, stranger. That first correction opened a trail. From the buried bodies, we moved to the workshop where they were born. Rano Raraku did not feel like a ruin. It felt like a factory that had stopped mid-breath. Figures still trapped in the mountain, giants half-released. The process was not finished. It was interrupted. From the quarry, the trail led outward across the island, and there we found the memory of movement. Not hauling, not dragging, walking. The old word mana turned the stone from cargo into something that had been commanded to move. The island's own voice remembered the statues walking upright, balanced, dangerous, alive. And after movement came weight, the red crowns, pukao. The island did not stop at carving giants. It quarried a different stone, a red scoria, and lifted 12-ton cylinders onto the heads. The statues became assembled figures, 2 stones on one body, grey tuff and red crown. The added burden made no sense as decoration. It felt like a component. Then we looked at where the statues stood. They turned their backs to the endless ocean. They faced the land. The platforms rimmed the coast, and the stone faces watched inward. One statue is a monument. A ring of statues becomes a circuit, a system of attention fixed on the living island. And beside the stone, we found wood, the rongorongo tablets, incised signs, a script nobody can now read. The island had a language carved into fragile wood, but the readers vanished. The stone remained. The instructions went silent. As the trail widened, the stone itself began to speak a different tongue. Volcanic tuff, iron-rich rock, a landscape shaped by fire. The island was not only a place, it was a material, a body that could vibrate, hold charge, respond to force. The Moai did not stand on the island. They were made from it, shaped from it, tuned to it. The map pulled back. The Pacific became an archive, not an emptiness. The island sat alone, but its loneliness began to feel like a clue. Drowned coastlines, submerged peaks, the possibility that the ocean had covered older ground, and the Moai began to look less like an isolated wonder, more like a surviving summit, a node in a pattern that once stretched further. None of these pieces alone proves a lost machine, but together they form something harder to dismiss. The buried body, the frozen workshop, the walking memory, the red crown, the inward gaze, the locked script, the volcanic material, the drowned map. Each step made the next step feel less like speculation, more like a shape that had been waiting under the surface all along. The pattern does not give us the missing manual. It does not tell us exactly what frequency the stones were meant to touch, or what force the system was designed to stabilize. But it makes the old story feel too small. The story that said these were only idols, only status, only a cautionary tale about a society that cut down its last tree. Now, after the whole island has been read, the Moai no longer stand as isolated statues. They stand as silent sentinels. The hardware survived. The world that knew how to operate it did not. So when we return now to the first image, the stone head above the earth, the body buried below, the face looking inward while the ocean stretches behind, what does it say to us? And so we return to where we began, a stone head rising from the earth, a face that once seemed to stand alone against the sky. But now the image has changed. Beneath that familiar profile, beneath the long ears and the thin-lipped mouth, the buried body presses down into the dark. Hands that were never seen by the old postcards rest at the sides. A carved spine runs down a back that has not felt sunlight for centuries. The giant is not a severed head. It is a whole being, wrapped in soil, held by the slope of Rano Raraku. The red crown that once completed this figure is gone now. Perhaps it lies somewhere in the grass, cracked and half hidden. Or perhaps it was never raised here at all. But in the memory of the island, that weight of red scoria still belongs. The body was grey volcanic tuff. The crown was red stone from Punapau, and together they formed something more than a statue. They formed two parts of one device, a body and a capstone, a receiver and its elevated load. The face turns inward, as it always did. Not toward the endless ocean, not toward the horizon where ships might appear, but toward the land where people lived, where fresh water seeped from the rocks, where crops struggled in thin soil. The Moai watch the island, not the sea. They are a ring of stone attention, a circle of silent faces all gazing toward the centre. And behind them, behind every platform and every fallen giant, the Pacific stretches away into a blue emptiness that may not be as empty as it looks. The sea that surrounds Rapa Nui has swallowed older shores. It has covered coastlines that once held forests, settlements, perhaps other standing stones. What we see now is only the part that stayed above water. The rest is an archive under the waves, a drowned floor where no one can walk and read the surface. The island is a surviving summit. The Moai are the sentinels that remained when the lower land disappeared, and the language that might have explained them is locked. The rongorongo tablets sit in museums, their incised signs still waiting for a reader. The wood is fragile. The glyphs run in lines that reverse direction, a script that refuses to yield its meaning. The last people who could read them died without passing on the key. The stone survived, but the voice that gave it purpose fell silent. We have the hardware, we do not have the manual. Perhaps the Moai were not idols in the way we imagine idols. Perhaps they were not merely ancestors turned to stone, not merely chiefs and priests made permanent. They may have been something closer to instruments tuned to the island's own pulse, to the tremor of the earth, to the magnetic field that runs through volcanic rock. Not statues that simply stood there, but components of a system that once worked, and then stopped working, and then became only stone again. The familiar story is not erased by this thought. It is not proven false. It is simply revealed as incomplete. Like the head that turned out to have a body, the accepted explanation covers the visible surface but does not reach what lies beneath. The buried layer is not a different story. It is the same story, extended downward into a part we have not yet fully excavated. And so, the Moai remain. They stand with their backs to the sea, their faces to the land, their bodies half consumed by the slope. The red crowns are gone or fallen, the tablets are mute, the quarries are frozen, the roads are littered with fallen shapes. The system is silent. But the giant still watches. The past has not been solved tonight. It has only been read a little more carefully. Another layer has become visible, and the question that now lingers is not a question about Easter Island alone. It is a question that can be asked of many ancient places, many standing stones, many faces that rise from the earth with their bodies still hidden. How many other ancient objects are only the head above the ground?